All right. So who are you and what do you do for work every day?
Yeah, start with the basics, right? Yeah, so my name's Nicholas. I have been in RevOps for 13 years, give or take. And I've always actually been in RevOps. And what RevOps is, in a nutshell, is basically the combination of sales, marketing, customer success, and potentially, depending, finance operations all into one department. And the idea is to bring all of the revenue operations functions together into one, combining the views, priorities, and day-to-day tasks into one centralized function, and making sure that we all have a one single source of truth centralization of all the information. And that can mean multiple different things, from day-to-day operations to system management to enablement, training, so on and so forth. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell. I worked at bigger companies like Salesforce and Thomson Reuters, and in the past 6 years, I've been working at smaller companies, really helping build and scale RevOps from scratch.
Awesome. I think you also kind of covered your definition of RevOps, which is great. So how does your current company sort of break down the different functions within RevOps? So like marketing versus sales versus customer success.
So we currently do not break that down too much. The reason is RevOps is a very new concept at Capmo, the company I work for today, and there wasn't an idea about the role before I joined. So I joined literally to build everything from scratch, define what the role is, define what it's not, which is also equally as important, and also help start fragmenting, but also unifying the operational functions into one, right? So right now we don't have a very clear distinction between sales, marketing ops, and CS ops, but mainly because of the size that we're in today. We're not big enough for that. And that is, I think, in my opinion, that is directly related to the size of the company. If you're small at around 100 to potentially 300, you might not necessarily need a specific person for each department. Not necessarily, you might. It will vary based on the company. But as you grow, you get more demand, you get more bigger teams, and therefore you cannot stretch thin across all of them with one person, kind of a catch-all approach, right? Especially because hiring and the skill sets of people that are involved vary differently, like greatly between one role and the other. So right now we don't have this breakdown, but my vision is to break it down more and more as we progress. But in the previous companies I worked for that were a bit bigger than Capmo is right now, we had a clear CS ops person, mark ops, sales ops. This was what I call the ops department or branch. And then we had analytics people, which have a very different skill set. They're more like data analysts. Then we had systems admins, and then we had enablement. So basically 4 different kind of verticals within RevOps. And that's usually how I break it down and how I kind of build the team.
Awesome. So I guess sort of in that vein, what do you see out there that isn't RevOps? Like what is RevOps not about?
One of the things that I've been getting more and more in the past is people thinking that RevOps is in charge of driving revenue. We're not in charge of driving revenue. We are in charge of driving the processes to enable people to do so. And most of the leaders that I've spoken to in the past have this idea that RevOps would come in to drive forecast accuracy and really build in that cadence, but it's not about that at all. Actually, we can at most teach people how to forecast, or help them to understand what forecasting is for and how important it is. But we can't drive revenue, right? Only the revenue teams can do that. We can enable them for sure, giving them tools, giving them more efficient processes internally, etc. But we cannot drive that growth or that revenue by ourselves. And this, I think, is the biggest misconception that people have about RevOps. And yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary.
Awesome. Thank you. So what are some of the most common mistakes that you see practitioners making in RevOps roles?
I think it varies greatly between the different visions, right? Some people, at least that lead RevOps, come in with a vision that a leader needs to be super strategic. And that's true to some degree, because in my opinion, you need to know how to execute, right? Even if you are a leader, and obviously this only applies for a degree of size of a company, right? If you're talking about an 80,000 people company, you don't have to be technical, right? But if you're growing and scaling RevOps, you need to be as technical as you could be a leader, right? And that would ideally be at 50-50 mark. So what I see a lot is people saying, hey, no, I'm here to build a team. But if you actually take a look at the person can't actually execute or be go into the nitty-gritty of it and deploy systems and do that. And you need to know how these things work to be able to execute the function better. I'm not saying that RevOps is the CRM that you use, not at all. But the more you understand how things are put together, the better you can put things together. And that is kind of what I've seen in the past be one of the biggest problems, but also one of the biggest mistakes as well, and also one of my biggest suggestions and hints for whomever joins. Usually you see leaders coming in from being an admin and then growing into leadership. But some people are just better in the admin side. So finding that balance is really hard across the market and the candidates. But when you do, that's, I think, is the biggest Achilles heel.
Awesome. Yeah, I haven't heard Achilles heel in a while. That's such a good metaphor.
Right.
I feel like people don't really use that anymore, which is a
That's
shame
true.
because it's just classic.
Yeah.
So you've been in RevOps now for 13 years, but when you were starting your career, did you start in RevOps? Like you've always been RevOps?
So no, I started in sales ops, and that's usually where people in RevOps start. Sales ops and RevOps are very different. Even though the day-to-day is similar, they have different approaches to the scope of the role. Sales ops just focuses on the sales side of the funnel, and RevOps encompasses everything and all the operational functions, right? So that's the biggest difference. If one person in sales ops cannot necessarily execute markups very well, because it's a different skill set and different knowledge, different systems, different everything. I started in sales ops and eventually got more and more exposure into the different areas. So had significant exposure to customer success operations, systems, how to build health scores, etc. Markups, the same for campaign management, for lead attribution, distribution, and gaining all those experiences allows you to potentially grow into RevOps. And that's the main reason why you wouldn't necessarily find people who have like 1 or 2 years experience as in their professional careers in RevOps, because you need time to build that experience. And usually what I see in the market is people advertising RevOps analyst roles to kind of be an all-encompassing thing, expecting one jack of all trades kind of thing. But that person will most certainly not execute that function across the board, because there's no experience, and people just usually think RevOps is just a rebranded sales ops, which is not.
Agreed completely. I come from marketing operations, and I see a lot of people saying the whole like RevOps is just sales ops in sheep's clothing and stuff like that. And I'm like, when it's done correctly, no, it's not. When it's
Exactly.
done incorrectly, absolutely. So I'm so
Exactly.
glad you brought that up. I'm actually going to be working on a blog about that, just because all of the marketing ops thought leaders that I follow are pretty anti RevOps. And I am not anti RevOps. I am very, very into RevOps as a function. And I was briefly on a RevOps team, but we just didn't have the manpower for what we were doing, and we kind of crashed and burned. But it was fun. And I liked getting to see like kind of like the 360 view of like the company, and sort of just like all of the processes, and not just campaign management and campaign everything.
Yeah, which is
So
interesting. It's interesting because the leaderships across the board, if you go into a bigger company, right, you will most likely find sales ops, mark ops, CS ops, and ops in general siloed into different teams. And
mhm.
trying to build the concept of RevOps in a company that's already 4,000 people or more is extremely hard, if not impossible, because you will probably never get everybody on board to make that kind of consolidation. And this is the biggest problem, right? Because leaders, they usually want their side of the ops to be close to them so that they have control. But it's less about control, but it's more about creating that unicity, right, across the company. And that's the part of the vision that is missing. Hence why a single RevOps leadership is so important.
Mhm. What's your first piece of advice for anyone who's trying to break into RevOps from another function?
I'm very much of a quality over quantity person, and RevOps, I mean, ops in general, I think is about the credibility you build, right? And to build that credibility, you need time, obviously, but you need to be 100% sure of what you're doing, and 100% sure that if you present something to someone, that is absolutely correct. Because in a meeting room with C-level people, if you present something, a leader presents something and it's wrong, it's not as bad as ops presents something and it's wrong. So if you do so once, you already kind of hindered the entire credibility. It's like if one thing is wrong, something else can be, and so on and so forth. I'm not saying that we get everything right all the time. It obviously is not the case, but we have to always strive in making things as accurate and correct as possible. So always take a deep breath. If you need an extra hour or two to deliver on something, take it, right? Make sure that everything is correct. So quality over quantity, and know your systems, know the tactical things, because with the knowledge of the tactical things, you will be able to develop different solutions in a more efficient and effective way.
Great. Yeah. So what would you say when people are having issues getting buy-in from leadership, or buy-in from the teams that they're trying to help? Just like they're not being listened to. What would you do in that instance?
I mean, buy-in or sponsorship is, I think, one of the biggest subjects for RevOps across the board, mainly because people think that this concept of RevOps is new. It isn't. It's just a combination of things that have already existed. But people don't really, not by not understanding what the role is, people don't give the attention it deserves. And that is a problem, because it means that you not only have to build it from scratch, but you also have to prove yourself from scratch. Because if you hire a VP of sales or VP of customer success, people already have a frame of reference to understand what it should do. RevOps, people don't even understand what it means. So you literally start from a different level. So building that credibility, building that buy-in takes time and patience. And if you do that in a consistent way, you will eventually get there, right? So patience is by far the most valuable advice I can give, I guess. And it is what I've been using forever. It's just patience. If you need specific buy-in, try to bring in value to the conversation, right? Because in my opinion, if you're in a room, you should ideally bring value to whatever you're saying. Or if you can't, just be quiet, right? That's my vision. So if you eventually can bring in that value and bring in a different perspective, you will already start showing people why RevOps is there and the different perspective people don't think about. And if you do that, people will naturally start listening and buying in and understanding what you're there for. So
Awesome. So I saw on your LinkedIn profile that you were working for South American companies at one point. How
yeah.
have you seen like what are like the major differences you've seen in terms of like how companies operate there versus in the UK or Europe?
That's an interesting question. So yeah, I'm from Brazil. So I've worked at different branches of the companies, the big companies like Salesforce, for example, but always in Latin America. Very different. They are very different, especially for ops. At least at Salesforce, for example, there was this big barrier blocker of people following processes. We just had this idea that, just do it. It's fine. It is what it is. I'm not talking necessarily, obviously, about company operations, processes that people had to follow for obvious reasons, but day-to-day operations, they were always trying to, find ways to circumvent whatever, right, they had to do. So building an ops function in a region or country where this concept is super new or undervalued, if you want to put it that way, is very challenging. In Europe or in the US is completely aside, because RevOps in the US is 100,000% fragmented and consolidated already. But in Europe, not really, right? It's a brand new idea, and it's just in the past, I don't know, 3 years or so that it's starting to really come to Europe as a whole. And in the UK, at least compared to the German market, people follow processes in a different way. They tend to think that processes are just there as a barrier and a blocker, not as an enabler. But in Germany, it's quite the opposite. People really take it seriously, and they really see that as an advantage. And I genuinely think that people are happy to let the process help them and see it and open their perspective to see the process as being an enabler rather than a blocker.
So yeah, I know a tiny bit about B2B SaaS in Germany, just because I have a person in my network who is doing startup work in Germany, and I studied German for 8 years, so I have like sort of like my brain goes to like the macroeconomics of Germany as like a country within the European market. So I kind of have an understanding there. So it's really interesting to hear that, because I feel like there are a lot of cultural differences between Germany and the UK, and that's an understatement.
That's an
Um,
understatement, for sure.
but just the way that they view operations, like that makes sense to me. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah. Is there anything in particular that you want to talk about that we haven't covered?
Um, I wouldn't necessarily say there is. I mean, do do you want to go into specific tools or anything like that? I get asked very random different questions depending
Sure.
on what it is. Um,
We could talk about sort of like we could talk about what your ideal tech stack could be, or if there's what people should do before they start implementing tech stacks is also it's a very hot topic right now is make sure you're operating before you start adding on all these tools because the tools are not going to fix anything if your data is not right.
yeah. I mean, that's a good point because even Excel is a good CRM if used correctly. And the tools will not solve your problems. They're just going to add up if what you're doing is wrong, right? So my recommendation or my strategy always is to understand the business that you're in and understand the people that are working within that business, because that also will dictate how you approach technology, how you approach enablement and training, so on and so forth. Now, the ideal tech stack, anybody who answers that in a very defined way probably missed the entire point because there isn't one. It's really based on the company that you are at and the needs of that company at that specific time, because it can change across the entire life cycle of the company. A company at 100 people might need a completely different tech stack from that same company at 500 people. So it changes. But one of the main discussions or talking points is Salesforce versus HubSpot, right? By far, that's the biggest one of them all. And not removing the merit from HubSpot, because I have been working with HubSpot at Capmo. And it's a good tool for the size of the company that they're aiming at, which is around 0 or 10 people to below 100. I'd say 50. That is, they even have different price points for startups, etc. Sometimes it's free depending on the amount of users, etc. So that works for that size of company. But the moment you start scaling and growing, it doesn't fit anymore, purely because of capabilities, right? And obviously there are HubSpot advocates, and I'm a Salesforce certified consultant, but that should be agnostic of what it is, right? And the function that it actually has. HubSpot is just not ready to take in. It tries to do everything, be marketing, customer success, ticketing system, ops, hub, as they call it, but it doesn't do any one thing super well and to the very, very bottom core of it. Clear example of this is validation rules, right? It's a massive gripe that I have with HubSpot that doesn't allow me to build validation rules with multiple different criteria. Super basic. And the reason I'm saying this is an example of something that you need to scale to enable, for example, data quality that you just don't get with HubSpot. And it's super basic. And it probably was step number 1 for Salesforce. So small things, user permissions is the next one, right? It's almost impossible to 100% detail what a user can do or can't do in HubSpot, because if someone goes on holidays and you need to rebook the meeting for someone, you need to be a super admin to go into someone else's calendar and change the link. Super small, but I need to give that person super God power mode access for something so basic. which in Salesforce you wouldn't do. And in a big corporation like Thomson Reuters, for example, you wouldn't, it's unthinkable to give someone temporary admin rights in a system like that. It just doesn't happen, right? So scalability of the system is by far the most important thing. You only know that if you've worked with multiple different systems. So my suggestion is always to understand the company you're working for, understand the processes, take a deep breath, and then go figure out the technology. Because if you think you have a problem, there's most certainly a SaaS solution that can solve it, right? So you will have options. It's just how you go about solving the problem that will dictate which tool you're going to get. So, and the tools are always going to have different counterpoints between each other, right? Gainsight, and then you have different options in marketing ops like Marketo, Pardot, whatever. They work in similar ways. They're always going to be a point different here and there, but they will eventually do what you need. The bigger players, obviously. But CRM-wise, Salesforce, for sure. I've worked in terms of marketing operations with Marketo, Pardot, and HubSpot Marketing, which, in my opinion, is the best out of them all, even the one in Salesforce, as HubSpot did start as a marketing tool. Customer success, worked with Gainsight, PlanHat, Customer Success Box. PlanHat was pretty good. And if you eventually grow, you will probably need a CPQ system to kind of streamline your quoting and deal desk function. So having that built in, you already have a very good solid foundation to grow and keep adding on different tools, and like Gong, for example, for enablement, or Brainshark and HighSpot, etc., for content management. But the foundation, or the CRMs for each of the departments, is the first thing you should look at. Salesforce, something for MarkOps, something for CSOps, and then you can eventually go on from there.
Awesome. This conversation has just been so good. It's so fun. It's my first video interview that I've done for the co-op. So I just really want to thank you for being my first interviewee. I don't think I have any more questions. I think we covered a lot of ground really fast, and it's been so cool just learning from you. And I can't wait to write this up and pull out just the best insights that you handed over to me. So thanks so much for your time, Nicholas.
Likewise, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully we're going to do more of these.
Absolutely. All right. I have a great day, or
You too.
well, a good evening.
Yeah, absolutely. You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.